Welcome everyone. It's Sunday, January 26th, 2025. I'm Philip Davidson. I'm coming to you representing the BCPS Employees for Freedom Society. Want to welcome all of our members who are joining us today. Want to welcome any new members who may be joining us for the first time. And I believe we're also going to be joined by members of the United Healthcare Workers of BC today. So welcome to all of you. We have a really special conversation for you today, which I'm really excited about. And I want to get to that in a minute and introduce our two guests. But just want to share a little bit, first of all, about who we are for those who may be watching this for the first time, and tell you about what we're about. So BCPS Employees for Freedom Society is a society, a not-for-profit society of current and former BC public servants who are nonpartisan career employees from all levels of government in the province of British Columbia. We stand for medical privacy and bodily autonomy. We're a registered not-for-profit society in BC, and we're formed in the wake of the BC government's unprecedented assault on medical privacy and bodily autonomy during COVID-19. And above all, we stand for freedom. Right now, we are actually sponsoring a class action lawsuit. A member of our society, our vice president, Jason Baldwin, is the proposed representative plaintiff in a class action seeking damages for infringement of Section 2D, freedom of association, charter rights, privacy rights, and misfeasance in public office pursuant to the COVID-19 proof of vaccination mandates that were imposed on the BC Public Service in 2021. And so right now we've had some pretty positive legal developments related to that action. And I just want to bring up my notes so I can share those with you. Okay. Do that here. It's not letting me for some reason. Okay, there we go. Just on January 2nd of this year, there was a ruling in the federal court in another class action lawsuit allowing it to proceed. And this class action also makes very similar claims to the ones that we're sponsoring in the Baldwin action around Section 2D charter right infringements. And so that decision by the federal court, while not binding on the BC Supreme Court, is very persuasive. And it's very encouraging to see that action moving forward. We will put a journal article link in the chat related to that, but you can look up the case. The plaintiffs in the case are Payne, Harvey, and Maloro versus His Majesty the King. This is the Feds for Freedom, or Federal Public Servants Group, whose action is moving forward. It's now going to be appealed by the federal government, so it will go to the Federal Court of Appeal and quite possibly end up in the Supreme Court of Canada, as there's very important implications for Section 2D charter rights in that case. Further to the action that we're supporting, we are fundraising for the class action. The representative plaintiff in that action will not be able to bring the action forward unless we're able to get reasonably close to the fundraising target that we have of $500,000. So we do have a fundraiser set up on Give, Send, Go. We'll include the link to that in the chat here for everyone. And we just encourage, if you're with us tonight, if you're watching this later, if you could go there and maybe donate $10 or whatever you can reasonably afford, that is much appreciated and will help us to see this legal action go forward. As we said, we're seeing positive legal developments, and we really do want to help those who've been harmed by the mandates and stop government from doing it again. So we're going to move to our conversation with our guests now. We will have time for questions at the end. If you'd like to maybe increase the chance of your question being addressed, please put it in the chat and we'll go to you first. But otherwise, just hold your questions until we get to the Q&A period, and we'll bring our guests on now and just have a bit of a chat about this topic that we have advertised in the description for this meeting related to ideological capture in the public service, and this sense that there is a seemingly progressive secular religion that has come to dominate public institutions in Canada and in British Columbia particularly. But we're very curious about this moment in time that we're living through right now. Is this rigid belief system now sort of teetering on the brink, or is it becoming further entrenched in BC's public service? And does it endanger the lives and liberty and prosperity of the people who the government purportedly serves? So we want to talk about that and more with our guests, and I'll just introduce them now. So uh, joining us today, we have Nick Osmond-Jones, who is a former BC public servant and whistleblower who has brought to light startling examples of ideological indoctrination and capture in the BC public service. And with him, we have Jonathan Kay, who is a Canadian journalist and senior editor with Quillette magazine, which has published stories about Nick's experience and ideological capture in the BC public service. And John, is a frequent commentator on issues like those we'll be discussing today. So I just want to bring Nick and John on. How are you guys doing today? See if we can unmute you here. Just a second. Okay.
I'm doing good.
Excellent. Glad we can hear you.
Yep.
And Nick should be able to.
Hey, I'm doing excellent. Happy to be here.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much for being with us today. Nick, I wanted to go to you first and just ask you a bit about your story. We did share the links to your articles that were published in Quillette and online with this meeting. But for those who haven't heard your story, tell us a little bit about, first of all, your work as a public servant, and what kind of led up to the actions that you took that revealed what was going on within the public service. I believe you worked for a time at the Ministry of Health, and so our public service careers overlapped for a while. But it was a big ministry. I didn't know you then. We didn't know each other. And then you went on and were working with the ombudsperson, and that's sort of when this happened. So tell us about that. What is the ombudsperson as well, and what's their role, and what was your role there?
Yeah, so I spent, about 11 years in the BC public service, most of it as a policy analyst or an investigator. So that's what I was doing a good chunk of the time I was at health. I was investigating healthcare complaints. And then I ended up at the BC Ombudsperson's office, which is, a parliamentary office. So working for the parliament, basically. So not per se part of the public service that way. But basically, what my job would be just investigating complaints about anything to do with the public service almost. That included crown corporations, healthcare, jails, all sorts of things, forestry things. So really diverse amount of complaints. So I'd have everything from somebody complaining about the quality of the food in a correctional facility to somebody complaining that they hadn't been fairly issued a firewood cutting permit. Just you never knew what sort of things you were going to get. And I thought it was a really, really cool job. Like to me, it was about is kind of like the conscience of the public service. Like, are we treating people fairly? Are we following the rules that have been laid down? And is everybody doing it in a moral way in accordance with all the laws and principles of natural justice and stuff like that? And from being just a policy analyst, a lot of the time I was fairly low on the totem pole and felt fairly powerless a lot of the time. It's hard to change anything. And it felt really good, it felt like a lot of power in a lot of ways because somebody would complain to you, and if you thought, geez, it doesn't seem like this is very fair, you could phone up just the executive director, even the ADM, and be like, hey, I'm calling from the ombudsperson's office and I want to know about this, and they'd return your call immediately, and they'd be wanting to make you happy because nobody wants trouble from the ombudsperson's office, right? So it felt like really empowering. It's like, wow, this is a really, an important role. I'm really getting things done here. I was able to, get some people some better results when I thought they'd been treated unfairly, and I thought that was pretty great. Um, but as with pretty much everyone who's been a public servant, I'd already noticed, that things are starting to change. There's rituals creeping into everything. The introductions of, introducing your pronouns, a land acknowledgement in front of every meeting and stuff like that. And it kind of creeps in slowly and you just sort of get used to it. And at some points I was like, I don't agree with this, but whatever. I'm just doing my work and that is what it is. Um, but I started to get fairly doing research on things and seeing like what exactly is going on and got pretty concerned about the gender stuff and really realizing like these are some pretty crazy beliefs that are going on, and they have some serious real world consequences. Like if we're going to let men into women's spaces, like there's some serious consequences to doing that. There's some bad men who are going to do bad things in women's spaces. And performing like very serious medical interventions on like children and youth that are irreversible. And I got pretty concerned about that. Um, so at the ombudsperson's office, once a year, they would have training that was office wide, so about 120 people all signed into a Zoom thing. Um, and they'd have somebody, give us talks on issues to do with fairness, things to do with our work. And they had a trans non-binary lawyer come in named Adrian Smith. She's a woman, but she says that she's somewhere in between a man or a woman. Um, and gave us a talk about trans rights and how this relates to our job. And it was just the most over-the-top ideological stuff that you can imagine. Like sex exists on a spectrum. There's this innate sense of gender in everybody that must be respected immediately. That's demanded by the courts. So anybody says this is my gender, I'm a woman, they have to be treated as a woman in all aspects of that. So just a couple hours of that in front of the whole office. And at the end, it was time for questions. And I wanted to ask, how do we have respectful conversations about this? Because, you're saying this, there's a lot of people who have concerns about that, and it feels like we're not able to have that conversation. I was just able to start broaching the fact that some people disagree with it, and she just absolutely went up one side of me and down the other. Basically said, I'm going to stop you right there, compared me to somebody who would exclude black women from bathrooms, said I was dog whistling for genocide, all of those things. So I was just like, whoa, in front of my entire office, hey? And instead of, the host of the meeting from my office saying, anything to defend me, they thanked Adrian Smith for her grace at the end of that. So, I just said thanks for answering my question and let it be and shut my mouth for the rest of the meeting. And sure enough, a couple weeks from then, I was called to have a meeting with my manager and the assistant. I was the deputy ombudsperson, where I was told, that the deputy said he hadn't understood what I'd done wrong at the time. Didn't quite understand it. It seemed okay, but then he'd been educated by people in the office on the transgressions and the dog whistles that I was doing and stuff, and said that I needed to take some remedial training. I'm sure I agreed that I'd screwed up, and I said I did. I said I don't agree that I screwed up. I'll do whatever you tell me to do. I'm not going to be insubordinate, but I'm absolutely not going to agree to take some training or admit that I did anything wrong. So they had me take some remedial course on like respectful communication, and then that was sort of it. But after that, I'm really thinking like, what sort of an office am I in here, and what am I participating in? I think a lot of people have felt that too. You get to a point where you just absolutely can't ignore it anymore. You notice that it's absolutely everywhere. and you notice that it's creeping into real world like policies. Like I'm not going to go into details of any of my complaints, but you start to notice that like I can't actually give this person fairness because there's like political or ideological considerations that I'm not going to be able to get pushed through in this office because of the ideology in the office, right? Um, so I was
I want to
getting,
ask you about that. Sorry to
yeah,
interrupt you, but just to go back to this experience. So the ombudsperson's office invited a lawyer,
yeah,
a fairly prominent human rights lawyer, I understand, an activist in kind of the transgender space from Vancouver. Also, I might add NDP, a prominent NDP activist. I believe she's chaired NDP conferences and so forth into the office to presumably do like a workplace training session, probably about the additions to the BC Human Rights Code around gender identity, gender expression. But when you kind of tried to delicately bring up this issue that not everyone necessarily agrees that there's no difference between men and women, etc. She just laid into you. That must have been kind of a threatening experience in front of your colleagues to be addressed that way by a
yeah.
lawyer.
I mean, it was, but it wasn't really unexpected either. And I mean, that's why I recorded it. I kind of thought, like, I wonder what'll happen here, you know? Like, I thought, it could go either way. Like, she might say, like, oh, thanks for raising that. Let me tell you all the reasons why I think you're absolutely wrong, or it's terrible to even bring it up, right?
Mhm.
Um,
And then the outcome of that, which was you were called into the office of the senior executive to be further dressed down, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah, and that was kind of interesting because I know there was a few people in the office who reached out to me who said, they agreed with me and they were surprised at what had happened. And I said, well, it's not really shocking. And then like, oh well, hopefully our office will think about it. And I'm like, well, I wouldn't be surprised if I'm going to get disciplined. And people that
Mm,
have been there longer, like, were like, oh no, I don't think so. It's like, well,
mm.
no, I do think so. Because
And
I
and
think
so like
that,
I've read your articles too, and you talk about the duty of impartiality as a public servant. When you're serving the public, you don't necessarily agree with everyone's beliefs or religions, but you're there to serve the public impartially in the same way as serve everyone. And that's what that office is kind of about, the ombudsperson,
well,
looking at administrative fairness in the public service. And then suddenly you're in these training sessions where you're being told what to think and believe, etc.
that's what it's supposed to be all about, but that woke language is creeping into everything, and there's debates going on within the office, and there's people openly saying, we need to get rid of this language about us being impartial because impartiality is just a cover for perpetuating the systems of patriarchy and heteronormativity and all of these things, right? So they're really impartiality is just a fig leaf for white supremacy and everything else. Like those are conversations that are openly or were openly being had within that office when
Hmm.
I left. So they were throwing impartiality out the window as far as I was concerned, which I think is crazy because an office like that, like its very purpose is defined by its impartiality. Like it just doesn't function without it. Like that's why it's there. That's why people reach out to you. Like, okay, the ombudsperson will take an impartial look at that, but they're just throwing that out the window.
Right. And so you also wrote in your article that then like I guess after this experience or maybe leading up to it, like work there became the equivalent of demonstrating to your boss that you were a card-carrying adherent of what had become in effect an official state religion. And I was really struck by that comment or that observation that you were observing that these beliefs sort of constitute for you what seemed like a religion. You had to be part of that religion to be accepted within this workplace in this office that's serving the public.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people were probably a lot more effective than me at just keeping their heads down. But like just within the 2 years I was there, I think an example of that is like pronouns in the email signature. These things sound, like sometimes a lot of people would say, I think like, who cares about this, right? A couple of words in an email signature, what does it matter? But I think it's very consequential because it's a symbol, right? it really is like a symbol of loyalty or that you've bent the knee or whatever it is. And when I arrived in that office, 2020 or so, say in my small team of about 8 people, I think one or two of them had pronouns in their email signature. And by the time I left, I was the only person who didn't. So it spread quite quickly. It spread quite quickly, and I think people were like, "Okay, I'm not going to be the last one who's not, d demonstrating that I'm down with the new vibe, right?"
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think a lot of us can, identify with that experience, having worked in the public service in recent years. I kind of want to get back to that, but like the mentality of the average public servant working in a ministry and organization, you're not very high on the totem pole, but you kind of have to go along with things if you want to survive. But I'm curious then about the action that you took and how you connected with John. And I want to bring you John in a second and like get his thoughts on this. But what then motivated you to and tell us what you did as a result after you said you recorded this session with this trainer, this lawyer, and then shared information with John.
Yeah, well, I'd recorded that session that I'd had with the lawyer. After I was dressed down, I kind of just kept my head down. I thought, I've got 4 kids, no savings to speak of, any of that. So I was like, well, I need to keep this job, right? My family depends on me. I better just shut up. What I should do is, I know it's bothering my conscience, so I'm just gonna keep to myself. I'm gonna work on my cases. I'm gonna avoid this office politics and stuff like that as much as I can and keep my head down. Um, so I didn't do anything for quite a while, but then several months later, the ombudsperson, Jay Chalk, he does an annual thing where he sends out an invite to anybody who just wants to meet with him one-on-one and, talk about how things are going, how are things in the office. So I accepted that and I had a chat with him and I told him, some of my concerns about basically I did feel like there was a bit of a secular religion that was taking over and it was compromising our ability to be impartial and to be able to do our work. And he's a great poker player. Didn't really give me any ideas of how he responded to it, but he was really polite and everything like that. Um, so I thought, okay, maybe something will come of that. And then I'd stopped going to these training sessions because when I was dressed down, I said it was unfair to make me go to these things. And he was like, "Oh, well, you don't have to, it's expected that people would want to, but you don't have to." So, okay, I won't. Um, but then I found out that a few months after I had the meeting with the ombudsperson, they had this just absolutely crazy anti-racism um, education session that even the people that I would say were like fairly woke people in the office were like, "Whoa, that was pretty wild. That was a little crazy." So I couldn't resist taking a look. I looked at the slide deck that we'd posted on the office intranet, and it was so crazy. And I just thought like, okay, so the ombudsperson, like he didn't listen to me at all. This is just going like full speed, like into the weeds here. And I sent it to John at that point. I was like, I have to do something about this. And you reach a point where you're like, you have to do something, or else you're just part of the problem, right?
All right, well, I want to bring John in here and kind of get his perspective when he first saw this material from you. And John, again, welcome. Thanks for joining us. And I mean, you're a very prominent journalist in Canada. Sure have a worldwide following and write a lot about these kinds of issues. But what did you think, and kind of what was your reaction to the information that Nick was bringing forward? Oh, got on mute again. I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have changed that setting. Here we go.
Sorry, it's this totalitarian regime where I can't speak without someone allowing me. Yeah. So I get a lot of people who come to me. It's actually quite rare that I get public servants. And the reason for that, it's happened more and more in the last couple of years. But one reason for that, and I'm generalizing here, is that um, Nick mentioned in passing that he had 4 kids, right? And it's like, well, you have to think of that. And I often have people, not just public servants, who come to me and they're like, "Hey, I have this explosive story. Like, let's blow the lid off." And I have to sometimes say, like, "Well, tell me a little bit about your life situation," because I say, like, the best person to blow the whistle is a 25-year-old who doesn't really want to continue in their current profession, or like a 65 or 75-year-old who has enough money and status and pension that it doesn't matter if, like, they're let go because but for someone who's 35 or 40 or 45, it's tricky, right? Because you're old enough to have commitments, but young enough that you can't necessarily write your own ticket, right? And in government, no one can really write their own ticket. Like, there's all kinds of reasons to get fired. And so government, I don't want to generalize, but government jobs tend to attract conservative personality types. And I don't mean conservative in the political sense. I mean conservative in that, I had friends in law school and college who, like, they did digital startups, and they quit the law firm at age 35 and did, like, one guy did stand-up comedy. And um, you know, the sort of person who goes into the public service and stays there often does not have that personality type. Like, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just so going along with that personality type is also not like talking to journalists, because part of being a public servant, especially these days, is you're often told, like, if there's any media inquiry, call our comms team. Here's, call Julie. There's always someone called Julie in the office. Call Julie. She handles internal comms, and she'll tell you who handles external comms. And especially, I'm sure people on this call remember about COVID, like any reporter calling about COVID. I talked to doctors at my health club. It's like their hospital was like, as soon as the word COVID is mentioned, like, you know, you have to run out of the room and, talk to our comms people. Like, it was just, they were so terrified that they'd say something off message. So yeah, I'm not used to getting a lot of tips or calls from public servants for that reason, despite the fact that they often have the greatest reason for exasperation. Now lately that's changed. Like, lately, I'm getting a lot of, like, emails and screenshots. COVID really changed things because in COVID, everything was online, so it's very easy to record stuff. If you're in a room of 100 people and it's like, "Hey, everybody, surprise, brown bag lunch, special guest, Adrienne Smith. She's going to tell you about why you're all a bunch of transphobes." And it's tough to be like, I mean, you can record it on your phone, but, it's kind of like feels secret, or, well, what if someone sees? Or whereas if you're on Zoom, or Teams or Skype or the thousand other things we learned to use during COVID, it became much easier. And so I began to hear from more people. And also, people who follow me on social media kind of learned that I generally, well, not generally, I religiously will protect their identity. Now, as Nick learned the hard way, sometimes you can't always fully protect the identity, because if it's a small group of people who has a set of information and you're known to be somebody who's sort of heterodox, they can circle around and say, "Hey, like, I'm having a situation now at Brock University where these are not public servants, they're academics, but the Brock University Union has 580 members. It's an academic union, of whom, like, maybe 30 or 40 attend their meetings. And one guy has just been consistently giving me the recordings of all their meetings, which are exactly what you'd expect them to be. And there's like two or three people in the meeting who are known to be shit disturbers. And so everyone at the meeting is like, "Oh, gee, I wonder if Brian and Julie are recording this." It's like, because, so, I mean, as much as I do protect my sources, sometimes, people aren't stupid, and they can look around a room and say, that's why the best sources are the people who never say anything. They've gone through, for 10 years, they've gone through resetting their pronouns and land acknowledgements without, like, ever saying anything. And then they come to me and say, you know, I'm just a fly on the wall here, but would you like to see some slides? And I'm like, yeah, I'd love to see some slides. And then, I'm not sure people on this call, if they saw the article about the anti-racism, maybe I was that they were certainly in tweets. I actually my memory is so bad, but I forget if that anti-racism stuff made it into
Yeah.
an article. I think it did. Wait, it must have at
I
least
think it
one
was
article.
just
We,
you did a thread.
But then we embedded it
Yeah,
in your article, right?
yeah,
That
you
thread got
embedded the
yeah,
thread and
we
yeah,
shared your
yeah,
tweets as well. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So okay, and so I get that kind of stuff a lot. Um, at least I did when people were still doing it. See, one of the consequences of this is, oops, as a journalist, you kind of don't know to what extent you're making a difference because if this kind of story dries up, to a certain extent, it's because people are on notice. It's like if you have a bat crap DEI session and bring in people who like compare the Canadian government to the Nazis and say that, Canada created the template for the Holocaust, which is what actual slides that were contained in this crazy DEI session that Nick had to endure, or that Nick's colleagues had to endure. Um, like people are going to notice and they're going to mock you and it's going to become a thing. And one thing about conservative people, they don't like things. Like they don't like to be in the news. I'm in an industry where I love it when my articles go viral. Um, I'm guessing people listening to this, a lot of their bosses, they don't want to see their name in the media because if they do, it's usually not good. Um, and so I'll report something like this, or I'll facilitate a writer like Nick writing something like this. And people sometimes ask, oh, like, did people get fired? Was like just did was like this crazy reaction. And usually the answer is no, because people people kind of want to get on with their work. Like they don't want to dwell on this stuff. The effect you usually see, which is unfortunately it's undetectable, you don't know, is that the next year when like Anti-Racism Awareness Week comes around or the other 17 weeks that, the same thing, they don't get the crazy speaker. They don't bring in Adrian Smith, who, by the way, said incredible. She said that saying LGB without the T was hate speech. As soon as somebody says LG, that was the thing about Adrian Smith's presentation that stuck in my mind. She says as soon as somebody says LGB and doesn't say T, they're a hate monger. Like that's hate speech. Um, and so again, the people, I think it was Nick used the term poker face, which I think is the term that was used in the article. The kind of person who gets to the, deputy chief or chief level, they play politics. And you don't win in as a public servant the game of politics by getting your name in the paper all the time and bringing in crazy speakers and getting a lot of media attention for this kind of thing. So you can say, "Oh yeah, I'm four square, all in favor of this DEI stuff, pronouns, line acknowledgements, you name it." You say that, but then when the next year comes around, like you kind of you implement the lessons you learned the last time you did this and it became a crap storm. And maybe like for your DEI session, you bring in somebody who like might actually have helpful advice about the workplace. Like how do you help disabled people manage a workplace or people who have ADHD or like I'm actually not against DEI consulting if it's actually like helping people who have real workplace issues. Um, I am against it when it's like, teaching people that they're all white supremacists, and women have four penises and stuff like that. But so to me, it's I love what I do, but often the main effect of what I do is just you prevent the next Nick from having to endure this. So like the success is measured in what doesn't happen next time around, as opposed to what happens in the particular case that you're covering with the article in question.
Right. So there was a lot of risk, Nick, for doing what you did by connecting with John and releasing that information. And it kind of progressed. And so, like Nick or like John mentioned, it's easier to identify you if there's not a lot of people who are um, resisting, this kind of atmosphere in the workplace. And I guess that's kind of what happened in your case. Can you just tell us about like what happened to you in the ombudsperson's office after this?
Yeah, it was several months after I'd leaked that slide deck. I came into the office one day and had been there for a little bit, and then the manager said, "Need you to come downstairs like right now. So I knew something was up right then and there, hey, when it's totally unannounced meeting that you have no idea of, and you need to come and immediately meet with it was like an executive director and an HR person. Um, and they marched me down there and sat me down and gave me an envelope and said, "Look, you're being placed on administrative leave." um, starting right now. The details are all in that letter. They weren't even going to let me go back up to my office and like get my coat or my bag or anything. I had to promise, I'm not going to cause a scene or anything. Just let me grab my stuff. So I grabbed my stuff and got out of there and read the letter. And it said I was suspected of being the person who leaked that document about the anti-racism session. So, I got home, I sort of figured out what I was going to do. Like they didn't mention why they suspected it was me. To this date, I've got no idea whether or not they had proof or not. Like I wasn't all that careful about it, so I'm sure any sort of careful like forensic audit of the computers would be able to tell um that it was me. But like after thinking about it and, whether or not I wanted to participate in their investigation, like I figured, the only way I'd be able to keep my job is somehow saying I'm sorry. Like, yeah, I did. Oh God, it was a terrible mistake. Somehow, hopefully I can be rehabilitated, or just lie about it, right? And hope that they don't have enough proof to actually prove it was me. And I didn't want to do either of those things. I was actually quite proud of having like done something, at least, whether it had much of a result or not. And, being off work a bit is like thinking about like, do I want to be back there? Like I don't. I hate working for the public service is kind of the reality of it, right? I don't want to do this anymore. I don't feel like I'm doing anything good. Um, so I went and got a job at a tree service, and I quit my job. I just resigned from the ombudsperson's office, and I've just been going from there. The tree service didn't work out, but I ended up starting my own little business, and it's just me doing my thing, and it's awesome. I'm so much happier. It's just a incredible like change in my mental health and everything. Like I think it really, really wears on you working in an office where you don't feel good about what you're doing. And I think, even if it's not conscious, it wears on you. And you tell yourself it doesn't matter. These are little unimportant things and stuff like that. But yeah, it's hard to deal with.
So you had to make a really difficult decision there, and it was a moral decision, I guess, for you. You known you had done something that sensibly breaks the rules by releasing that information. But you could have fought it or could have lied about it, but you owned up to it and just resigned. I think the title of your article is like "How I Blew Up My Public Service Career," and you can too. So I want to talk a little bit more about that later because I think that's like a really interesting lesson for all of us who are confronted with moral quandaries in the workplace as public servants and like what we decide to do about those things. Or John referenced this earlier about how very senior bureaucrats rise to the top is often by playing politics or just I guess putting their conscience in a freezer or a locker, what have you. Um, but you were motivated to do otherwise. So I do want to explore that more, but I want to circle back to this question of belief because you had mentioned it. It seemed like it was to you. I think it seems like to many of us that we are kind of encountering this religious belief system or ideology. It's really captured a lot of our, if not all of the public institutions in Canada. And I'm just curious to hear from both of you about like, why you think and how and why this ideology, this secular religion, has been so successful in capturing our public institutions in Canada. I'm really interested in like the underlying beliefs and the social dynamics that give its strength. And I've been studying. I'm in university now and doing a lot of reading, and I've come across people have commented on this phenomenon in the past, and I think it's very true. But there's a American legal scholar, Harold Berman, who's written a lot about the intersection of law and religion. and he wrote that people will not give their allegiance to a political and economic system, and even less to a philosophy, unless it represents to them a higher sacred truth. People will desert institutions that do not seem to them to correspond to some transcendent reality in which they believe and believe in with their whole beings and not just believe about with their minds. So, as much as this ideology seems to most of us like to have kind of, quite frankly, crazy beliefs in some respects, there are people who seem to believe this, like sincerely. I don't know in what proportion they are in the public service or just in society in general, but Nick, you and I are in Victoria. John, you're in Toronto. I think it's pretty common to encounter people who believe these things. So, what do we do about that as people who kind of question them? And what do we do about our institutions that kind of enforce these beliefs and this religious thinking?
Well, I mean, I think John probably has more of the meta idea because he's hearing from people in all sorts of different areas. But I mean, I'm not one to believe in conspiratorial thinking usually. Like just from I think anybody who's worked in the public service for a long time would realize how we have so much trouble just doing like regular things above board, coordinating them. Can you imagine the public service trying to do something like infinitely more complicated than the things that we admit we do and keeping it all secret? Like, sorry, the competence and isn't there. The ability to do it isn't there. That said, though, like the way this woke mindset has kind of become most prominent in like the places where it needs to be most powerful, it seems strategic. It seems strategic. If it isn't strategic, it's some people have been very, very smart, or it's been quite a coincidence. Like the way human rights tribunals, like is there, I don't know if there's anything that's gone more insane than places like human rights tribunals. And these are the exact like levers of power that enforce this kind of thinking. So I think, and universities, right? And the universities crank out the next grads who come in. So it seems like a very smart and precise application of power. How it's happened, I don't know, but that's one thing.
Go to you, John, here, just a second. There we go.
Hi. By the way, just Janet Hopkins had a good question. She says, if they're so proud of their professional development objectives, why would they care if they were leaked? That's in the chat. You see this all the time where they they do the professional development and it's like, this is the most important thing in the world. We're so proud of what we're doing. Uh, we want this to be a model for every other unit in our company or agency. And then someone like me leaks it and they're like, who did this? Like, who's trying to make us look crap? And it's like, well, which is it? Either, you're dancing with angels and you want everyone to see you do it, or you realize because really what they mean is within our little clique, we have the conceit that this is saving the world, and so we're proud of it in that narrow context because we're all kind of we all are all supposed to buy into that normative set of ideas. But we all kind of, the unspoken truth is that if this leaks into the outside world where 90% of people live and work and surf the internet, they're going to look at this and realize that it's crazy, and we don't want that to happen because everyone's going to laugh at us, which is my job. So in terms of why people believe this stuff, Nick is quite right that because I've done worked as an editor or as a writer on so many of the stories, I have theorized about it, and I think it's a few overlapping things. One is that human beings are obsessed with evil, and they love theories about why bad things happen to good people. And wokeness, as it's called, I'm not sure people still use that or we're allowed to use it, but it is to a certain extent it supplies that, right? We live in a post-religious society. We all have religion-shaped holes in our brain. And wokeness says, well, I know what happened. We know why bad things happen. It's because people are infected with the original sin of racism and sexism and transphobia and homophobia. And if we eradicate that original sin through psycho-spiritual, self-examination and rituals of repentance and confession, and we bring in high priestesses like Adrian Smith, who, of course, we're not supposed to contradict. My God, no. It's like standing up in Sunday sermon and telling the priest that he's wrong. Um, maybe in time we will be able to eradicate that original sin. And by the way, you often hear people use that kind of language, like especially when it comes to indigenous reconciliation. It's you often hear self-described white settlers say, "This is a lifelong project." I will have to interrogate the whiteness inside. They use terms like interrogate, disrupt, educate, and they use words that evoke the idea of people in prayer. I will sit silently in discomfort, as I let others hector me about my privilege and my white supremacy and so forth. So a lot of this is, as Chesterton said, when people stop believing in religion, they'll believe in anything, or which to that effect. And I'm not a religious person, but I recognize the psychological hole that religion leaves in people's brain once it leaves. People want a theory of evil, and wokeness it doesn't supply a theory of human satisfaction. That's why it's such a morose movement. But it does supply a theory of evil, which is that, evil is basically from bigotry. It's from unrealized privilege. It's from, I don't have to explain. So one thing I found is that you can take away people's angels, but they get very mad if you take away their devils. Devils are very precious to people. And when tell people, well, actually, I don't think I'm a white supremacist, and to be honest, I don't think you are, and I don't think our widget company is a white supremacist company either. Like certain people become furious because they're like, but that's my whole thing. Like that's how I explain evil in the world, that we're white supremacists. Like if you take away that theory, how do I explain why bad things happen to good people? It's like taking a religion away from somebody. So that's one reason. The other thing is that people are obsessed with status. And so once you say, okay, look, the dominant paradigm for explaining evil in the world is is racism and sexism and transphobia and all this stuff, you're also saying the the main way we are going to gain status in the world and within our organization and within the overlapping ecosystems of social media that govern these spaces is by posturing as incredibly diligent and even ruthless in our attack on this source of evil that we've discovered. It's sort of like being a Scientologist, and I'm like, well, I'm at 29th level Thetan Overlord. Well, I'm at 32nd level. Like people, because Scientology is one of many cults and creeds that have purport to explain why evil exists in the world. And you advance within that organization by demonstrating your often fictional understanding of how to fight back against this evil. And that's the same as, if you want to call it wokeness, um, that's why the jargon people use is so impenetrable. The impenetrable nature of the jargon is a feature, not a bug. Because in the same way that, priests were once required to speak Latin, um, because it was great that people couldn't understand them. It meant that like they were close to God. And why do the plebes have to understand this stuff anyway? What they need to understand is that these people are close to God and you should emulate their moral example. Um, so so it's a theory of evil and then a search for status. And then once it becomes ensconced as a status building ideology, then you get people who don't believe it and just do it anyway. Like I tell people, say, why do you say Gesundheit after somebody sneezes? They says, well, people will think I'm polite. It's like, exactly. And polite people are good. And that's the reason 90% of people put pronouns in their email. It's not because they actually think men can become women or women can become men. They either don't believe that or don't care about it. They just want people to think they're polite. And so I actually don't care about if putting land acknowledgements or putting pronouns in your email becomes a regular thing. In the same way, I don't care if people say Gesundheit. What I care about is, as Nick said, uh, the fact that it symbolizes it's seen the reason people demand it is it's seen as symbolizing your ideological adherence to an associated set of ideas, specifically that men can become women and women can become men by saying magic spells encoded in pronouns. And that's what I object to. So that's my theory.
Yeah, and there's like this element of enforcement of belief, and is that maybe why
You get
the
status. Enforcers
it
have
gets
status. Yeah. Yeah.
right? And like these institutions where, this belief system has really taken on a life of its own, provide like a ripe setting for that because, all of us who have been or are currently, employees of the government, like you're beholden obviously to your employer for your paycheck and so forth, and they're kind of like expecting these things implicitly or explicitly. You have to go along with them whether you agree with it or not, and it kind of like overrides people's consciences,
Well, it overrides, but it also overrides the traditional workplace hierarchies. Like Nick said a very interesting thing, and he had it in the article where his the deputy chief, is that was it
Deputy ombudsperson.
deputy ombudsperson said to him, and this was definitely in the article. Well, at first at first the scales were before my eyes, and I didn't realize how Nick's words could be offensive. But then I was educated by presumably somebody half his or her age, and they enlightened me. Um, Now, there are very few contexts in which a 25-year-old can go to like a 30 or a 50-year-old or 60-year-old or like somebody who's like two or three or four or five pay grades above them and say, "You're wrong about this, and here, let me tell you why." Um, but on this subject, you can, because in the same way that, like in communist societies, children would inform on their parents, and parents were terrified of their children. Uh, this is an aspect of the Soviet Union that George Orwell got perfectly in 1984. It's at the very first chapter of 1984. He alludes to it, um, because as soon as you identify a sacred creed, and not a sacred creed that is mastered by, it's like Talmudic study where you have, ancient rabbis or like an indigenous society with gerontocracy where the elders have mastered all this information. This is the opposite. This is where the sacred knowledge is held by blue-haired 19-year-olds who make, videos on Tumblr, and they are the holders of secret knowledge. And if you're a young person ambitious within an organization, of course you're going to buy into a creed that flattens the workplace hierarchy and allows you to, to go lecture your boss about, how he's getting his pronouns wrong. Like it's such a it cuts off like 20 years that you'd have to have your nose to the grindstone to get to that level where you'd actually be able to, to talk to that person as an equal. Suddenly, you've been at the office 18 months and you're giving everyone lectures about pronouns. Like if you're lots of people are ambitious. There's nothing wrong with that. And people aren't stupid. They're like, well, this ideology allows me to leap pay grades in terms of my moral authority in the workplace. Why not? Right? Like it's everybody else's fault for letting those people get away with it.
Yeah, there's very, very clear practical motivations for people to kind of cynically, I guess, go along with things for personal advantage. I'm wondering if either of you think there's anything particular about Canada or Canadian culture or Canadian character that gives strength, to this way of
Nodding
thinking.
vigorously, nodding vigorously.
What is that?
Well, I just blab for a long time.
Well,
Nick,
Nick, go ahead, and then John chime in whenever you want.
yeah.
Well, I mean, it's being polite, right? I think we're not generally like confrontational as a culture, anyways. We're fairly polite. We try to go along to get along more so than, really be confrontational and get in there. So I think there's that. That's definitely one of the cultural things. And we've probably been a little more like the Overton window has been a little further to the left, and some of the politically correct ideas, or I think we're maybe more ensconced. And I think, there's a huge difference, I think, between wokeness and say what was sort of left wing and what was considered like the movement of political correctness. I think wokeness is a strange cyborg that's just bolted itself onto those things and hijacked them completely. But it's been able to do it like extremely effectively, and it's also been able to, get into the law, right? Like we've had changes to, federal legislation and stuff like that. That makes this stuff law. Like you face more than just ostracism, right? Like there was a restaurant owner who ended up getting fined, I think something like $30,000 or something like that for not respecting the pronouns of his non-binary server. Like, so this stuff has like serious consequences in it now. And even if you do think it's completely insane and you'd love to stand up against it, maybe you don't want your entire livelihood ruined over it either.
Yeah, by the way, there was a study that came out about a year ago uh, where they had resumes and they'd give different resumes to different employers. And one resume, it was the same resume, but one said I'm non-binary and the other said like I'm a man or a woman. And surprise, surprise, the non-binary person didn't get as many callbacks. It's like, well, yeah, no shit, because there's like, if you're non-binary, you're going to be here 6 weeks and then file a human rights complaint because you got misgendered by the photocopier. Like, I mean, there's no one cares if you're non-binary. What they care about is that you're a grievance collector who's just like got your antenna up for, and there is absolutely a correlation uh, between those two foes. So yeah, I wouldn't. I would think twice about hiring they them, not because I care about the conceit that they aren't male or female, which is stupid, but that I just don't want to have to deal with what the inevitable human rights complaint, 2 months from now, because yeah, someone used the wrong monosyllable to refer to them. In terms of the Canada-US thing, by coincidence, I just got a media inquiry from this. I don't know if you know the website, The College Fix. It's this conservative website in the US, and they interviewed me about why, because I tweet about all these stories, and I tweeted this thing about this crazy thing, University of Alberta nursing thing that I tweeted, which I won't get into, but if you follow me on Twitter, you know a little bit about it. Um, and they're like, like they cover this stuff all the time, but they're like, even by our standards, Canada is so insane. Why is that? And I talked to them about it. One is politeness. And a lot of, by the way, this stuff does start with politeness. Like the pronoun stuff, 10 years ago, I absolutely was, if a man says I use female pronouns, like my default Canadian thing was, oh, okay. This is before they started insisting on getting into women's prisons and women's sports. And I just thought, well, it's the polite thing to do. Um, until fairly recently, I still do it. I mean, or at least my reflex is because I want to be polite, and Canadians are more polite than Americans, and I don't think that's a bad thing. The other thing is America has this cult of individualism and the idea like anyone can grow up to be president. And so they just have this natural resistance to a lot of these theories of bigotry. And I think a lot of Americans take it too far. There's a lot of conservatives in the States who don't take racism as seriously as they should. Like a lot of things woke people talk about, they're real problems. It's just they take it too far. Um, and then the third factor is 30% of Americans are evangelical Christians. And in any group or organization in the I used to live in the United States. So you go to a law school, you go to an employer law firm, there's always going to be a core of people who do have religion. And it doesn't mean religious people can't get swept away in political manias. It happens all the time. But it means that they have this other source of moral authority in their life that acts as a kind of anchor. Uh, you may not like the point that it's anchoring them to, but it means that they're not just like bobbing on the waves wherever the politics takes them. And Canada doesn't have that. Like when I speak to groups like this in Canada, it tends to be like disaffected liberals. It tends to be some conservatives, but people with whom I speak the same language generally. It's like the language of disaffected liberalism. Whereas in the United States, when at my law school, the Federalist Society and stuff, a lot of it was like they were deeply Christian people and the conservatism and their Christianity went hand in hand. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that that's not where my politics comes from. So in Canada, you don't have that core. Like I said, I think something like 30% of Americans are evangelical Christians. In Canada, I think the corresponding figure is like 10%. So especially a place like BC, fairly left-wing place, in your typical public service staff um, group, you're probably not going to get like a whole bunch of people who come to politics from a Christian perspective. It's just, and that's just one difference between Canada and the United States. And the fourth factor I would identify, and this is extremely important in BC, is the Indigenous factor. Um, Obviously, there are Indigenous people in the United States, and obviously it's a political issue there, but it's a much bigger issue in Canada, especially in the last 10 years. And it's impossible to overstate just how much this issue has affected any discussion about like intersectionality, like even gender. You know, people say, "Oh, human biology is an artifact of Western racist colonialism." You know, when Westerners came to North America, Indigenous people didn't even have a word for penis because they didn't even know what sex was. Like everything was just what big one. And people will actually argue this. Like you find
Adrian
academics
Smith
inter
did.
I mean
Adrian
it's
Smith
it's
did.
fucking batshit. And like you have to have 7 PhDs to actually believe this stuff. Like no ordinary person could believe this. And you do find people in the United States who, I went to Ivy League school, and there were people there who believed it. But in Canada, you go to university, there's like whole departments of people who argue this crap. And a lot of it is because we feel very guilty, and we should, for a lot of the stuff we did to Indigenous people. There were some real historical crimes. And again, like a lot of progressive woke stuff, this started in a good place. It started with how can we make this better? How can we atone for these historical sins? And people, including people like me, are like, well, will land acknowledgement help? Okay, let's do that. Will doing this help? Okay. And then, but before you know it, it's just ends up being this performative nonsense, and you're not actually helping Indigenous people. But Canadians get suckered into this stuff more, in part because our Indigenous reserves, many of them are very remote, and most people in Toronto, and I suspect most people in Vancouver, have never actually been to an Indigenous reserve. So instead, they get their knowledge about the issue from like CBC, where they're told like, well, the way you can help is by acknowledging your colonial racism and stuff. And, oh, okay, I'll do that. And so I think a lot of it is, and then that sort of bleeds into like the BLM stuff and the gender stuff. But I think the prominence of the Indigenous issue in Canadian politics, and particularly in as it's sort of refracted through academia and the labor landscape in public service unions during the Trudeau era. That's been a huge component of it, is in my opinion, especially in BC, where I mean BC is the Indigenous politics are much more important than a place like Ontario. So that's obviously a huge issue.
There's so much there that I want to like get into. I would like to get into, but we've only got so much time, and I know there's people who have questions, and I have some more questions as well for you about this. But yeah, I definitely see a lot of all of those things that you've mentioned really vividly here, living in BC, living in the capital in Victoria.
Oh my
And
God, that's the worst. That's like the epicenter of craziness. I was in Victoria, by the way. It was like being in a loony bin. Like I don't know how you guys. I mean, to me, I'm actually in awe of Nick and you and everyone on this call. Like I wouldn't last 4 minutes in the public service. Like I have a close relative who's in the public service in another province, and like she tells me these stories, and I'm like, how did you not jump up at the t on the table and say, I can't work with you idiots? It's you have superhuman patience that you could even get through a week. Like I'm not a functional adult or mature enough that I could actually live a week of your professional life without telling everybody around me that they were stupid idiots. Like I don't know how you do it. You
Yeah,
must be.
well, like we live and breathe and swim in these waters, right? So we're surrounded by this kind of thinking all the time. And I generally like a lot of people who kind of think this way. I disagree with them a lot of things, but I have to be polite to be Canadian about it or tactful. And also try to like understand them, like where they're coming from. And that's why I'm like really interested in the religious stuff because I believe it is
Right,
their religion. I believe it is their second. So I want to be respectful of people's beliefs, but where I have a problem is where those beliefs are imposed on me, and
right.
there's penalties and consequences for not subscribing to something which I can sort of say is
So
demonstrably untrue, you
I
know?
have a theory that a lot of the opposition to vaccine stuff. So I kind of part ways. Like I horrify people by telling people I've been vaccinated 5 times, and like I'll do whatever my doctors tell me. I'm like just a complete robot when it comes to that. However, my belief is that a lot of the people who are opposed to vaccine mandates, to some extent, yes, it's about body autonomy. Like those issues are all, I respect that. But it's also the issue is a metaphor for like, I oppose you telling me what to put in my body, just like I oppose the 10 other things you're trying to get me to do. So it kind of becomes a kind of proxy issue for a government that's telling you, how you should self-identify, how you should feel about politics, what you should say, you know, um, the regulatory quote unquote nanny state and like all this stuff. And the vaccine stuff to a certain extent, it's like it isn't just that when people complain about that issue, it isn't just that one issue. It's the whole cluster of issues that it represents, which I think, that's one of the reasons the convoy was so popular,
Yeah,
at the
I think
time.
there's a real nexus there. I mean, as a society, we stand for freedom. So
Yeah.
choice, informed consent, those sorts of things, and medical privacy and bodily autonomy. We have many members who did get vaccinated, but they didn't agree with the mandate.
Right. Yeah. Which I respect that position.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Um, we are living through a really incredible moment, I think, in time and in history. Canada seems to be in crisis right now, vis-a-vis our largest trading partner. We're less than a week into the Trump presidency. Trudeau has announced his resignation, but prorogued Parliament, so he remains in place, and it appears, a hand-picked successor will be installed, and we'll see what happens after that. But all of this is kind of related, I think, to what we're talking about, this belief system, this kind of secular religion in Canada, which is so prominent, so strong. But it seems to be being severely challenged right now around the world, maybe less so in Canada. You mentioned just now, John, the trucker convoy. It happened 3 years ago. That was probably the largest manifestation of public discontent and rejection of government policy in recent memory. It nearly brought that government down, and it resulted in the invocation of the Emergencies Act and basically martial law, which was then later found by the federal court to be
Right.
ultra vires the Constitution and everything. So, and is going to be challenged and so forth. But we're in this moment, and these things are happening. I want to share something that was said just a few days ago at the World Economic Forum by the president of Argentina. He gave a pretty astounding speech to all of the people there. And I'll just share a few excerpts of what he had to say and his kind of take on the whole situation. So he said that the winds of change are blowing in the West and that historic times of change have a unique characteristic, that old formulas become exhausted, unquestionable truths are called into question, and rules are rewritten. He also said that the great burden of the countries and institutions that are failing is the quote, mental virus of woke ideology. This, he said, is the great epidemic of our time that must be cured. He said this ideology has colonized the world's most important institutions, and it is essential to break these ideological chains if we want to usher in a new golden age. He said the political formulas of the last 40 years have failed and are now collapsing under their own weight. The script of the last 40 years has run out, and when a system runs out, history opens up. And he said, therefore, these are times that reward those who have the courage to take risks. So, how would you respond to that? Is this kind of way of thinking on its way out, or do you see kind of Canada, British Columbia kind of falling deeper into it and kind of retrenching, as it were?
I mean, I would love to say that it's on its way out, but I think we're just getting started here in Canada. It's so deeply entrenched. Not just in society, but legally. Like here in BC, I don't think a lot of people know about the Anti-Racism Act that's been put in. And it's extremely wide-ranging legislation that basically embeds every kind of insanity about wokeness into the public service. Like it's got to be part of, every hiring decision has to consider, intersectional values and everything like that. Every policy. It takes like the ideas of Kendi about, every policy is either racist or it's anti-racist, and it puts it into legislation. So maybe members that are current members of the public service understand what's happening with that now. But if that's actually being implemented within the public service right now, like it's going to be really hard to get rid of that. Like there's got to be huge apparatuses being built around that. And we're seeing like it looks like it's infected the judiciary as well. Some of the decisions that we see come out of the judiciary, it looks like it's very ensconced there. It's very ensconced in the professional societies. It's completely taken over our universities. So it's going to be really, really hard to get out. And even our opposition to it seems very feeble to me. Like, that we see people like here in BC, we have, say, the Conservatives under John Rustad, and federally we'll have Pierre Poilievre. And they say, I'm against wokeness and stuff like that. But when you talk about the actual specifics of things, it's all very bland. It's all very bland. Like even Polyev, when he talks about genders and stuff, he'll kind of make some jokes and stuff about it. But will he actually come down and say, maybe we shouldn't be doing sex changes to kids? He
Yeah,
won't
I think he
actually
will.
say that, right?
I think he will. I history moves in cycles. And the president of Argentina, fortune favors the brave, as they say. Um, I in some ways, look, BC is a special case because I don't, you guys gone so Fruit Loops, it's going to take longer to kind of deprogram yourselves. But history moves in cycles, and one of my fears is the opposite, is that progressivism has made itself so deeply unattractive to people that we're going to go the other way. And I mean, I my whole career as a journalist, I'm basically on the side of whoever's losing the culture war. And for the last, 10 years, it's been conservatives losing the culture war. But I'm no fan of Trump, and although I agree with a lot of stuff he's doing. So this thing he did was one of his first things he did was he said, you know, fire everybody in every federal agency whose job is in DEI. I feel like 5 years from now, when the conservatives finally win an election in BC, that will kind of be what they have to do. They say, like, do a search and replace in every piece of federal legislation, and where it says, intersectional, yeah, put merit-based, and that will be the law. And it's going to happen, and I just hope it happens in a way that preserves liberal values, and we don't whipsaw back to like populist conservatism that goes overboard. I mean, my politics, I voted for Justin Trudeau 10 years ago because I thought he was a kind of like it was just going to be middle of the road Canadian boring liberalism, which is what I support. I didn't know he was going to like start saying we're a genocide state and men have all these penises or women have all these penises, and he was going to be like taking a knee to BLM and you know and introducing intersectional budgets because Nick, you talk intersectional budgets in BC. Several years ago, in his mandate letters to cabinet ministers, Justin Trudeau explicitly said you have to perform an intersectional gender-based analysis to determine how your policies impact women and BIPOC. Um, and people take their cues from the top. And I don't think in the United States, for instance, over the last 6 months, it's no coincidence that all these major corporations have been stripping away their DEI departments because they see which way the wind is blowing, both from consumers and also from government. It's going to happen in Canada, and it might even happen in BC. I just hope it happens in a way that, like, when we all get together a decade from now on this call, we're not complaining about like conserve. Do I have time to tell a brief story
Go right
about
ahead.
this? There's this CBC comedian, I forget his name, but he's been around for a long time. And he was talking about how he was getting like the most hits on the CBC YouTube channel. and they fired him because like he wasn't politically correct. Like he wasn't, telling like racist jokes or anything, but like, he was telling jokes about like non-binary people. I actually it was pretty funny.
Was that Rick Mercer or?
No, no, absolutely. Rick Mercer lives a block from me.
Okay.
He's old like me, but no, this is a fairly young guy. He's actually in New York making a killing stand-up. Oh God, what's his name? 5 minutes after the call ends, I'll remember his name. I actually interviewed him for the Quillette podcast, but he was telling me about how, like at the CBC, they have these meetings. Well, you can't say this, you can't say that. But he said something very interesting to me. He said, "What's interesting is that I think it was 10 years ago, he and these fellow comedians were on this conference call because they wanted to get funding for some comedy festival they were doing. And they were this was during when Stephen Harper was prime minister. And the guy on the other end of the call was saying, well, this has to be a family values comedy thing, and you can't make jokes about this, and you can't make jokes about Christians, and you can't do this. And it was basically giving him a list of things he wasn't allowed to say. And so he said to me, he said, I'm only 35, but I've lived through two government programs telling me what I'm not allowed to say. One under Stephen Harper saying it had to be family values friendly for me to get my government grant. And now one where it says like I have to pledge belief in gender ideology and BLM in order to get my grant. And he says it's the same people, it's the same language, it's phrased in like we have to be polite and respectful and Canadian and it's just one was from conservatives and one is from and I do think be careful what you wish for, you may get it. Too much of a reaction to this. And it's the progressives' fault. They're making themselves so hideously unattractive. It's like when you go into the restaurant saying, whatever he's having, give me the opposite. And that's what people are doing now. Like they're so turned off by this that they are electing firebrands in many countries. Like there's these countries in Europe, they're electing real racists. I don't think Poilievre is a racist. I have serious concerns about Trump, but um, I think we should be mindful of the fact that the devil we know, we focus all our attention on it, but like around the corner is it, it could be another kind of devil. So like we have to remain firmly grounded in liberalism. So I'm very like the speech that the Argentinian president gave, like I don't like that. Well, it makes me nervous as a Canadian because I'm like, let's 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 not go nuts here. Let's just like things were pretty good 10 years ago. Let's just go back to that, right? Before we were all white supremacists. Like that's good. I liked it back then.
So
Yeah,
I'm here. Go ahead, Nick.
can I say one thing? Because I recently listened to Lex Friedman's long form interview with the president of Argentina. And I mean, when you get down into like he's brilliant about economics. He knows so much more about it than I ever will. But when he gets into the weeds about the stuff he wants to do, he's saying like, look, all environmental regulations are just a conspiracy invented by bureaucrats to give them more power. And I hear stuff like that. I'm like, no,
That's not true. That's
it's
not
good to have rules that you're not allowed to dump arsenic into creeks and stuff like that. Like we don't want to come in and say, okay, we're scrapping all our environmental rules now. So I share the concerns about the pendulum swinging back the other way. Just I wonder like how is it going to swing when so many of our institutions are completely governed by this ideology now, like when it's all the professional institutions, the regulatory colleges, the places like the ombudsperson's office and the human rights tribunals and the judiciary, and like it takes more than just a pronouncement from the premier or even the legislature or anything to change it. And maybe BC is that special case where it's just going to take us longer.
you're even the caboose gets to the destination. You guys are I'm sorry, I have to go. I have to go eat dinner
Yeah,
here.
absolutely. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Well,
Uh,
we don't want to keep you any longer, but maybe we'll just thank you if you have to go. We can Nick can stay on and take questions if that's okay.
Nick is the star here because he's the hero he's the guy who blew up his career. So
Yeah,
anyway, I wanted to thank Nick for his incredible contributions to Quillette and thank you for sorry I blathered on too much. I was kind of his plus one here. Um, and as much as I make fun of BC, you have a beautiful province. I was there a couple of months ago. I played the disc golf course on Pender Island. I mean, everyone there's crazy, but
nice.
it's beautiful. I mean, you actually have like this beautiful, it's the people are the problem, but the province is gorgeous.
Well, we like
Um,
that exchange. We need that diversity of ideas, true
yeah.
diversity here. So please keep coming back and sharing with us
Well, I'm
and
not
your
going to
perspective
Victoria
from Toronto.
again. I'm not going to Victoria again.
No, no, come to Victoria. Next time you're to Victoria, you got to come and see Nick and I will go for a
I
drink.
will
Yeah,
definitely come. I'll
we're
come to
not
see
all
you.
crazy.
I'll come to
Okay.
see you, and then I'm getting the hell out. Uh, thanks, guys,
All
and
right.
ladies.
Thanks,
Bye,
John.
everybody. Bye.
Thanks, John. Have a good night. All right, Nick, and so I wanted to ask you like one more thing, and then let's open up for a few questions, and we will kind of sign off. Uh, so yeah, going back to like, President of Argentina saying, uh, basically fortune favors the brave. Now's the time to take risks and I guess push back on what we've been talking about tonight. Um, you took a big risk. It had life-changing consequences for you. You feel it actually turned out pretty well, and you're in a good place now. What would be your advice to public servants who are working now in government and finding themselves in these situations, these kind of moral quandaries, or their conscience is being, intruded on by this, oppressive ideological thinking? What would you say to those people?
Um, I guess I'd say like you can't ignore your conscience, without it having consequences. So if you ignore your conscience or you're making moral compromises with yourself, all of that is going to affect you. Like for myself, I didn't even realize how bad it was affecting my mental health until I got out of the public service. And it really was just a feeling of gradually feeling the weight come off your shoulders and realizing that you don't have that terrible weight on you anymore. So I mean, I would encourage people to be true to themselves. And if you feel that you're morally compromising yourself, try to do something about it. On the other hand, I wasn't strategic in what I did at all, it was really a lot of it was quite shooting from the hip. Um, I'd say it worked out well for me. I'm happy where I'm at right now, but there's also people who've been driven to suicide, right? I think about Richard Biltzko quite often, the principal in Ontario, who, he said something in a DEI session and the chain of events ended in him ending his own life, right? So there can be serious consequences too. So like I would say it's probably smarter to be strategic about what you're doing. Um, and I'd think like if I'd been smarter, say, and been strategic in the ombudsperson's office, I could have talked about, like, look, these are the times where I can raise my concerns, with superiors, with that. I can, say I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do that. And, studied up on what the laws were and everything like that so that I knew that I was walking that line where I wasn't going to end my career, but I was also able to live within my conscience too, right? So it's going to be a different path for everybody, right? Like I did know on some level, like when I leaked documents, I don't want it to be like I'm crying about how terribly I was treated. Like even though it was just a training session, like you're not allowed to leak documents from the office. And I fully knew you're not allowed to leak documents from the office, and if you get caught doing that, you can lose your job. So I lost my job, I fucked around and I found out, right? So if you're not willing to pay the consequence of your actions, don't take it. But yeah, but do something. Do something because if we're all kind of waiting for, Polyev or whoever to come and rescue us, like that's not, I don't think that's how it's going to work. It's us that have to rescue ourselves, Like even if here in BC, I think the NDP probably the next election, by then I've got to think that people are sick of this garbage and kick them out. But even then, the resistance, will form within the public servants. Like a lot of people are very embedded and invested in this ideology. So I'd encourage people to do something.
Well said, Nick. I want to give people an opportunity if they'd like to ask a question to just raise your hand. I think we've got some questions in the chat here. Oh, here's an interesting one, Nick, for you. Do you think you can refuse to put a land acknowledgement in your email signature and refuse to put your gender? Is there legal protection to permit resisting? I don't know if you can answer that, but if you want to answer generally.
I mean, I have no idea, you know. I know at the ombudsperson's office, I had a land acknowledgement in mine because I was given like this is the template for our email signatures, and this is the land acknowledgement that goes into it. I don't know what would have happened if I said I'm not putting that in there. I mean, for our pronouns, people I remember it specifically being said, it's not mandatory, but we encourage people to, and I didn't. So I mean, until they say it's mandatory, if they do say it's mandatory to put a land acknowledgement in, what happens then? I don't know. I mean, the time I ran into that is when I was at advanced education. I was going to kick off a meeting, and I was asked to do a land acknowledgement for it, and I said I wouldn't do that, and I was told no problem, but you won't introduce the meeting then, somebody else will. So, there was no there would be career consequences for that, if you don't get any FaceTime anymore. You don't get to be the one who like is visibly organizing the meeting or hosting the meeting or anything anymore. So, I don't know. I mean, that would almost be an interesting challenge of some kind to an employment rights tribunal or something, I'd think, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there is potential there, I guess, for a human rights claim. You'd have to look at that closely, but if you suffer any negative consequences for not complying with that kind of order in the workplace, you might have a claim. Um, yeah, okay. I don't see any hands up at the moment. Just looking uh, again at the chat. If anyone would like a question, we've got a minute.
I'm seeing, could the pronouns be a violation of privacy? It's no one's business in the workplace. I think so, and that's actually even one of the things I think that Adrian Smith had said, is don't ask people their pronouns because then you could be forcing a trans person to out themselves. So I'd think that you could use that defense any time, right?
That's very interesting. Okay, I see we've got one hand. I think this will unfortunately be the last question that we can take tonight, and goes to Brett. So, Brett, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Right. Okay. Yeah, ruthlessness was mentioned before as part of this ideology. Wonder if you have any insight or any words you'd like to say about what I believe is a strong possibility that hundreds of BC public service workers were fired from their jobs because of this kind of ideology, um, carried out by, well, I I made a post on Twitter. I think you read it last week, and
Yeah.
it was all about Lori Wanamaker following through on the vaccine mandate to terminate us from our jobs. Do you think DEI played any role in that decision to continue the mandate all the way through to firing us when no one else was doing this?
It seems clear that it was, I'd say. Like, I mean, I never had any involvement with that or really any of the policy around COVID. But I know in the ombudsperson's office, like there was people complaining about COVID policies and stuff. I didn't get any of those complaints, but it was very much an ideological thing. Like it was just objected out of hand, like, oh God, these crazy anti-vaxxers. And it was very much, lumped in with all the DEI stuff. So the concerns were really like dismissed right out of hand. And the getting vaccinated was very much it's part of this secular religion somehow, and it's bizarre that it would be. None of these things should be related to each other at all, but somehow it has become part of it. Like I remember there was one coworker who shared with us pictures that she'd taken of her and her family, and they'd all gotten customized t-shirts made with pictures of themselves getting vaccinated and like we are all vaccinated, and it's so creepy and so cult-like and so weird. Like I say that as somebody who got vaccinated himself, but it turned into something else. So like I absolutely think that the firings and a lot of the mandates and all of that stuff, it's very much part of this ideology.
Well, I think all of us uh, can appreciate that, and it's been a difficult time the last few years, being as it were victims, I guess you could say, of this secular religion, this religious thinking, that this group think that seems to overtake our institutions, so prominent here in BC in particular. But there does seem to be something about history moving in cycles, and the winds of change beginning to blow. I think maybe our group is a harbinger of that as we carry forward the legal action that we're sponsoring to kind of force the government to answer for their actions and to hold them accountable. So. Um, I really want to thank you, Nick, for sharing your story. You've put yourself out there. You took some difficult actions and made some difficult decisions, but in many ways, standing up for your conscience, I think is inspiring to a lot of us. So we just really appreciate you, Nick. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, and we wish you all the best. And keep writing those articles. I think we'll keep reading them and sharing them. And just thank you very much.
Okay, yeah. Well, thanks to all of you. You guys are fighting the good fight as well, so I appreciate that.
All right. Well, have a great night, and we'll talk again soon.